Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Welcome to 2025. As we return from our extended Christmas break, we find ourselves in the mud with all sorts of political developments provincially, internationally, nationally to talk through. But before we get to that, a thank you to our friends at Uber for sponsoring us for another year on Political Capital. That support is critical to bringing you this show each and every week for free on your pod feeds. And also, thanks to our friends at Helijet for their support as well. All right, let us bring in the pod squad. Jillian Oliver, Green strategist, Jeff Ferrier, NDP strategist and principal at Framepoint Public Affairs. Thank you both for being here.
Happy New Year, Rob.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Ali Blades, our usual third member of the panel, is off attending the inauguration of President Donald Trump, who is a figure that will dominate today's show because, holy moly, things have become serious with the threat that he has made of tariffs on Canadian goods at 25%. So
folks, don't worry. Folks at home, don't worry, because I will step in and speak on behalf of that conservative side while Ali's away, and Godspeed to Ali as BC special envoy to the Trump government. If anyone can get him to back down, it's Ali.
Yeah, maybe she'll talk some sense into him, because the numbers that the BC government put out this week on the impact of the tariff to the provincial economy are staggering. $69 billion loss to the provincial economy over 3 years. The unemployment rate would go up to 7%. There'd be a $2.5 billion hole in revenue punched through the provincial budget, more than 124,000 jobs lost in the sectors hard hit here: forestry, mining, manufacturing, all sorts of different sectors that would be hard hit. So let's start there. The impact to BC, massive. What the premier kind of went out of his way to say he wasn't trying to scare people, Jillian, by saying this, but that he wanted people to know how serious this could be, to sort of let them know that the province is aware of this. Do you think that worked in his delivery?
Yeah, I think, since the election of Trump, he pretty much started talking about this potential trade war right away. It's all been hypothetical, but it's rapidly approaching when Trump takes office next week. So I think the government really wanted to have a key message of talking about how bad this could get, and really sort of laying out the worst case scenario, because we really don't know what it's going to look like. Trump has said 25% tariffs. It sounds like if he does go ahead with it, that it's actually going to probably be implemented a little bit more slowly. But, I think the government has got a lot of other things that it's doing behind the scenes. They're preparing next year's budget. This is going to be a huge hit if it goes ahead. So they really want to make clear to the public that this throws everything up in the air, that, we just had an election. A lot of promises are going to be made. We might not be able to keep some of them. And, basically it's because of what's happening south of the border. So having just a really clear message of, this changes everything, so that people are prepared, and that when they, find out what the tariffs actually look like in the coming weeks, they can sort of take action with that groundwork laid.
Yeah, you're saying, like you say, Jillian, this changes everything, Jeff. As it's kind of sideswiped the political agenda for a government that had sort of yet to unveil its political agenda after the election. Seemed like this is now priority number one, and everything else is on the back burner, Jeff.
Sure. It seems to some like the government, since the election results became clear, has been doing a little sleepwalking into office. Well, they've just jumped into a 5-degree pool of cold water and woken up to the fact that, wow, we are seeing an attack on Canada, on BC, jobs and businesses through these tariff threats. and it's forced the government to wake up and put forward a clear path to British Columbians about how we're going to deal with these threats. I think that putting out the numbers about the potential impact of the tariffs if they come into being is smart. BC is the only province that has done that. I think British Columbians need to be aware of what the potential impacts are on them and their communities. 124,000 potential lost jobs, unemployment shooting up to 7.1%, billions of dollars not going into government revenues because of personal and corporate income taxes being low. I think the Premier doesn't have a lot of clubs in his golf bag here. There's only so many tools, so many things he can do. I think he's doing what he can do, which is fighting the tariffs as part of a Team Canada approach, but also looking at growing the economy and increasing trade with more countries. But it's not about words. It can't be just about words. It's a government that is very good at words and sometimes not so good at delivering. So EB's got to act now, work quickly, cut red tape, approve economic projects that will create jobs and economic activity here and bring investment into the province at a really critical juncture that we're facing right now.
Well, let's talk a bit about some of the responses that he has floated here. Very specifically, he's pointed to a tech smelter in Trail that produces germanium, which is an item that the United States wants. China exports, but doesn't want the United States to have it. So there's that issue. Unfortunately, the zinc ore to make the germanium comes from Alaska. So it's a pretty classic problem that we find ourselves in very quickly when we start to try to respond to British Columbia. So there's that. We've got copper that we could limit. We have electricity to California that we could limit. And then he raised a bunch of other small scale things like, well, maybe we restrict American companies from bidding on government contracts or charge trucks that are moving through the province with goods to Alaska, or even restrict American alcohol on store shelves. So that suite of response from BC, what do we think of it, Jillian? Does it hit the sort of targets that people might be thinking? Does it encapsulate a good provincial response?
Well, I think, like Jeff said, there's only so many tools in the toolbox, and BC is small relative to obviously a behemoth like the US. But I think, some of those responses are as much about showing British Columbians that the government is doing something and that they're prepared to do something, as it is about sending a message to the US. I think right now, like I said, where we don't really know where the American government's going to land in terms of actually implementing things, it's good to sort of send a message that everything is on the table. I think that if, there is a chance of changing the president's mind, it's going to come from American industries who are so dependent on all of this trade, like you just described with germanium. Our economies are so interconnected that it's not as simple as just putting a tariff on one thing and that boosts, American industry domestically. We saw in the previous Trump administration when he put in steel tariffs that cost billions of dollars to the auto industry because they get their steel from abroad. So I think, just talking about the range of economic interconnectivity sends a clear message to those voices within the US that can sort of help cooler heads to prevail in the US by really just remembering how interconnected our economies are and how you can't really put in these kinds of measures without impacting domestic industry as well.
Yeah, maybe it reminds the Americans the full breadth of what's at play here. Jeff, every option the Premier raises also has a kind of corresponding impact on BC, right? If we limit electricity to California, we limit BC Hydro's ability to trade electricity and make billions of dollars there. If we, restrict American liquor on liquor stores, you can't get popular liquor. People are going to be mad about that too. So, there's a lot of options on the table, but there's also a corresponding hit to British Columbia as well.
Sure, and any response that Canada is going to make that's going to be effective is going to involve some measure of sacrifice from all of the provinces. BC can't stop tariffs all by itself. It can take some actions that contributes to a unified federal response, but it can't stop tariffs alone. I like the focus on the tech trail operations. It's also about recycling batteries for EV vehicles. You know, fast tracking projects like that is really important because we're learning through this just how important to BC's economy resource industry is, mining and forestry and energy. We're not talking about software tariffs. We're not talking about life sciences tariffs. The real big impacts on workers and communities and revenues will be resource jobs. So the government absolutely needs to look at resource projects, and while maintaining our strict environmental standards and focus on Indigenous consultation, which is required by law, they need to get more efficient at approving and permitting projects. The government says, and I believe them, that this needs to be like a wartime effort where we all make sacrifice, but we all work really hard to mobilize what we can to make sure that we blunt the impact on jobs, that we blunt the impact on revenues, which would have a huge potential impact on healthcare and education and everything that we're talking about that folks see the government as not acting as often or as well as they should on these issues. I've heard John Rustad and the Conservatives call the government's response a pop gun against a bazooka with the Americans. And I think that's true in terms of the provincial response, but as much as the provincial response can coordinate with all of the other Canadian provinces, we've got a pretty good platform to defend ourselves. And now the government has got to get beyond the talk, and it's got to get focused on action.
It feels like it might need to be a bit of an ideological shift for the NDP if they're going to start suddenly fast-tracking natural resource projects. It's not a government that's been known to support those, didn't support the construction of Site C, reluctantly, hasn't gone out to do any trumpeting of LNG Canada, which has come online, opposed the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Now we hear the Premier talking about expediting mines, which is not something you might associate the NDP with supporting, massive mines that can be dirty. And then the forest sector, which is just in shambles due to some policy. So, like, if the Premier is about fast tracking and generating those projects that Jeff is talking about to combat this, is that going to be difficult for an NDP government that doesn't really have a track record of doing that kind of politically?
Well, I mean, I think the other way to look at it is all those examples you just cited have gone ahead and are happening. And,
That's
you
true.
know,
Yep.
sometimes public communication is different from the reality of what actually gets implemented. And, you know, I think mining is a bit of a different one. There's a shift there because minerals go into so many clean energy and renewable projects. So I think that's a bit of a unique case. And there's been sort of a shift, kind of, you know, looking at those projects from an environmental perspective. We have seen them start to make some moves, like removing environmental reviews from power transmission projects and things like that are going ahead, starting to try to expedite some of those things. But I think that was very much part of the Premier's message this week is sort of giving themselves and laying the groundwork, that sort of political license to make a big shift from how they've talked about their priorities in the past. And I think, you know, by sort of using very strong, like, economic wartime messaging, in wartime, you have to, you know, take extraordinary measures. So trying to sort of give themselves that license to do things that might be contentious and a bit of a wedge within the party. It's going to be interesting to see, you know, how that actually plays out as individual projects go ahead. But I mean, I think the noise and the sense of urgency, if these tariffs go ahead, is going to be pretty overwhelming and hard to overcome from some of those traditional opponents within the party.
I think there will be some folks who hear these words and say, you know, this is the government that's going to roll out the red carpet for resource projects. We can't lose sight of the importance of environmental reviews and First Nations consultation. That can't happen, and companies don't want that to happen, because if they get anything less than legally defensible permits and approvals, they'll end up in court. Courts will overturn them, and the project will be no further ahead. So government absolutely needs to bring a rigorous view to all of these projects. What it needs to do is not undercut those, but it's to say to the public service, we need to get to a decision an awful lot faster than we are right now, because we can't wait given the stakes of the battle that we're about to enter with the Americans.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see, A, if that's possible, and B, how, as Jillian pointed out, the internal response to the NDP is as we start.
I don't know. I've heard that the public service is very good at being efficient and getting things done really quickly. It never drags its heels. It never puts up stop signs and roadblocks. So I have faith in the public service that they'll get this done.
Embedded in all of the mandate letters, which were released with this announcement of the economic impact of BC, it was a line ordering a spending review in every single ministry by every single minister about efficient spending, administrative waste, programs that are relevant to today, looking for efficiencies and things that are useful. So just let's start there. I think part of this must be trying to fill the revenue gap that could exist if the Trump tariffs go in, but also seems like an admission, Jillian. The NDP would never say this, but it seems like kind of an admission that some of the criticism of the health authorities for their vice presidents, which is also part of this review, might have been a little bit accurate. Some of the criticism about the public sector job growth being out of whack might have been a little bit accurate. Some of the criticism that there's too much bloat in the government after 7 years of massive NDP spending might be a little accurate in the fact that there is even a review of spending going on with the idea that they could find waste. But maybe I'm just being cynical about that.
No, you would never.
No.
I think, well, yes, I think like the review of the health authorities, that was actually already kind of quietly in the NDP platform. So that was something that was on the government's radar. That was something that was raised by both the opposition parties for many years. So much money being spent on administration and still so much failure to deliver improved access to services, especially when it comes to healthcare. So I think, this was something that the government was already looking at with respect to health, especially. I think, the other piece of that, when we had our economic updates in the last couple of months, the government said that their intention was sort of, to focus on growth and to grow their way out of the fiscal deficit. But now this throws a wrench in things. So they're going to have to look more at efficiency, which is cuts, most likely, and, hope that they can find some that aren't going to impact the direct delivery of services. So I think it's a bit of both, some of that acknowledgement that there was excessive bureaucratic bloat during the last 4 years, but also that there's more changes needed given the new reality.
It reminds me in the election, Jeff, of the Conservatives promising a core review and the NDP's response to that being, we can't be cutting services at a time like this for people at this critical time. And so I think everyone is now back in alignment on the idea that you can cut government at this point in some way. But what is your view of the spending review that's embedded in here?
Well, I think that it shows just how big of an impact that the Trump tariff threats are having on the government. This is a big pivot from what's in their bones, that government is a force for good, and any cut to it is bad for the public. I'm hopeful that the exercise will be less about cuts and more about refocusing resources onto the most important priorities that we have. And we've talked about health and housing and cost of living, but now it's got to be also on economic development and creating jobs, and they talk about a resilient economy, and that's really important. I think there's a political message in here too to the public. I think governments across the country are going to be asking Canadians and businesses and workers to make sacrifices as part of our countrywide effort to push back against the tariffs. And it would be discordant for any provincial government to ask that without having asked itself what it can do to contribute. And this line by line review of programs and spending, I think, is what signals to the public that we're asking you to sacrifice, and we will too.
The problem with a line by line review of spending and an idea of fiscal discipline, though, is that which is good, I think, is that a lot of government decisions are going to be contrasted with that going forward. Programs that they authorize, people that they hire, decisions that they make. If they're going to put a lens over top of everything of being responsible with money, Jillian, does it also produce a risk that they're held to that when they start doing things like hiring their friends or growing this sector or giving raises to people?
Severance payments.
Severance payments, which we'll talk about shortly.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think, governments are always kind of held to their most recent standards that they've set for themselves. But I think, what really stood out to me with this sort of report that the government put out on the impacts of the tariffs, as well as the mandate letters, is a really refocusing. So I would expect that they'll find a way to justify new spending under that lens. We're investing in this growth, whatever it is, the new priorities that they need to sort of retool their efforts to respond to the tariffs. And, if they can make a good case for that, then they will.
It's amazing. Running out of time here, but make sure you subscribe to the podcast because we'll have some more. But it is amazing to think we just went through a provincial election campaign where we weren't really talking about any of this, where a government got elected by a thin margin on things that it now might not be able to do, all of them. It's been completely sideswiped. It's a new dynamic internationally, nationally. A very volatile time in politics, and we're going to stay on top of that each and every week. Again, subscribe to the podcast. We got some additional topics we're discussing today, and thank you so much for being here, returning with us for 2025 on Political Capital. We will be back next week with all the latest in BC politics. See you then. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.